Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. We have a really wonderful speaker with us. And I just want to say a word first about our center. Some of you out there in this virtual event are familiar with the Center on the Future of War, and others may not be. So we are a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. We're here now in our 7th year of operation, and we explore the changing character of war and conflict related to all sorts of shifts in global politics, society. We run a number of different events, and this is part of our 2021 Spring Speaker Series. And you hopefully have received invitations for the overall schedule for the Spring Speaker Series. And if not, you can certainly find out about it by emailing us. So tonight we have Ike Wilson with us. I'll give a brief introduction of our colleague Ike in just a second. The event, just for a little housekeeping, it's 5:30 to 6:30 Arizona time. And I'll finish this brief introduction, and then we'll go right to Ike's presentation, and then we'll open things up for questions and answers. So Ike's talk is the utility of special operations facing challenges of great power competition and compound security. Isaiah Wilson III is a retired colonel in the United States Army, and he's recently named president of Joint Special Operations University. And even more recently, he's become a professor of practice with us here in the School of Politics and Global Studies at ASU, and we're thrilled to welcome Ike as a faculty member. He's a master strategist and leading advocate of change in America's approaches to security and defense policy, as well as a decorated combat veteran with multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. He served as chief of the Commanders Initiatives Group at U.S. Central Command from 2013 to 2016. Before that, he was the chief of plans for the 101st Airborne Division in Northern Iraq. That's 2003 to 2004. We were actually just talking about those years before the event began. He has a Ph.D. in political science from Cornell University. He was a professor as well as the academic program director at West Point, where he created the West Point Grand Strategy Program. And he's the author of Thinking Beyond War, Civil-Military Relations, and Why America Fails to Win the Peace. So thanks so much, everybody, again, for joining us. And here is Ike Wilson with his presentation. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone, for attending tonight. And first, let me just thank Daniel, Selenia Daniels as well, for all the help in getting me all set up for this conversation tonight. And I really want to set this up in a way to where I spend a few minutes teasing up some provocations, frankly. Around this question of the utility of special operations in this context that the rest of the prompt for tonight's talk really captures. You know, the utility of special operations, current and future, and the future is now, in two frames, really. This so-called return to or return of great power competition, in what we're teasing out in this notion of compound security, which is our Joint Special Operations University theory of next, as we do our own forecast analysis, environmental study of the global security environment, you know, outwards for the next 30 to 50 years. We're finding some dynamics that speak to what I'll call a proto-theory of compound security and the compound security dilemma. I think it's very important to understand as best as we can the playing field, if you will, before we actually start to dissect and talk about the players themselves from a use of force and utility of force standpoint. So that's really going to be kind of three parts to my pitch up front. And then I'm going to try to do as much of covering that ground. I've told and asked Daniel and Selena, I am, if anyone knows me and heard me speak before, I am cursed with the gift of gab. So I'll be willing to go on all night. I know we've got an hour and we want to spend at least half that time in Q&A and living room discussion. So I've asked Selena and Dan if I get too long, just throw the virtual hook on me and I'll stop, and then your questions and answers will help paint the rest of the picture. I'm going to try to put some initial brushstrokes on the canvas for us this evening. I just also want to just thank Daniel and Selena again, and Jeff Kubiak and the whole team and family there at ASU and the Center for the Future of War for not only allowing me to join the family as a professor of practice, very excited about that, personally, as well as our what it portends for a teaming relationship between our two institutions. and also just an opportunity this evening to spend some time with you. If you just give me a moment to fumble through a little bit of the Zoom administrivia here, I'm going to try to share a slide presentation. I promise you I'm not going to give you all a death by PowerPoint presentation here. I'm going to tell a bit of a story. But what I do want to do is just use some pictures to help me get the extra 10,000 words in a picture that I don't have time to talk through, and really just kind of give a backdrop. So I'm not going to be briefing off of any slides or anything like that, but I'm going to use the slides just as artful illustration to further paint the picture I'm going to try to paint out for us tonight. Before I go any further, I do need to make the standard disclaimer. I'm a federal worker here, and so even though I'm the president of Joint Special Operations University, I just need everyone to understand that my comments this evening are entirely my own, and they don't necessarily represent or reflect official policy or stance of the United States Special Operations Command, DOD, United States government, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really, Dr. Wilson, the professor with the academic and educational activity hat on. And so that allows me to exploit academic freedom and actually put some provocations in the air. And I think that's important for us to do. I like to start talks like this with a bit of art. And what you're seeing in front of you is a commissioned piece of work titled A Call to Colors, A Call to the Colors. And this was commissioned back in 2001 for the graduating class of the United States Army Command and General Staff College cohort for class of 2001, of which I was a member of that class. Watershed class year, given the watershed moment of 9/11, the attacks, the terror attacks of 9/11. The portrait was commissioned to really capture what 9/11 really stood for the nation and the world going forward, what I'll call a threshold crossing. And the threshold crossing idea comes from the works of Joseph Campbell and The Hero's Journey, and The Hero with a Thousand Faces and The Power of Myth, if all the backdrop to the Star Wars saga, and those of you hopefully understand the Joseph Campbell tie-in here. But as you see in the portrait, I mean, if you just look at the faces, if you look at what we call soft truth number 1 of our 5 soft truths, Special Operations Forces truths, the human element comes first, human over hardware, right? And the beauty of this portrait is you start from right to left and you see everyone from a broader construct of what it means to be a first responder, a first, middle, and last responder. You start with the firefighters. You see diversity and inclusion throughout this portrait. And all the way as you move to the left, you see the images that you see on the left is this hazy threshold crossing into the unknown, leaving the ordinary world and going into the extraordinary world, looking for an elixir to kind of follow the theme of The Hero's Journey, that Power of Myth arc of 5-act play kind of arc of the storyline. And not surprisingly, by the time you get to the left end of the portrait, you're seeing special operators, all right? This portrait really captures the last 20 years, last 2 decades of your special operations forces on point, on vanguard, at the edge, really redefining the edge, and in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. In the last 20 years, we've been operating in that space. We are at another threshold crossing today. And that's where I really want to start the conversation, defining the environment. Special Operations Forces, or SOF, like the nation that we serve, we're at a threshold crossing of a next era, and what we call a new 4th age of special operations. If you consider the first 3 ages, they really begin in the wake of World War II, with the OSS and General Wild Bill Donovan and the OSS years of Special Operations Forces. It goes through a 2nd age of Special Operations Forces, which is really the John F. Kennedy flexible response period of the 1960s up through the 1970s, the age of the Green Beret, and a focus on flexible response and the utility of unconventional warfare and unconventional force, foreign internal defense, and those types of operations that you saw your special operators conducting. Into the third age that we would mark around the period of the 1980s, when SOCOM, Special Operations Command, was born as a combatant command and a service-like organization in the late 1980s, up really through the threshold going through 9/11 and the last 20 years of focus on specific missions, defining a very specific slice of the complement and the full spectrum of special operations use and utility, but missions that you're most familiar with over the last 20 years, the last 2 decades, countering terrorism, countering violent extremist organizations, and the prototypical really contemporary mystique of special operations and the special operator that you're probably most familiar with from popular Hollywood movies and popular books that companion them. You know, the special operator on point, the Navy SEAL, you know, the Captain Phillips direct action strikes, the Bin Laden raids, those types of operations. Definitely became the prototypical image of special operations for the last 2 decades, but really in a broader history, in a broader context, only 3 or 4 of a complement of 12 different mission sets that have really defined what we call the classic core activities or core mission sets of special operations, going back through the World War II period and even going back to colonial times, with the likes of General Nathaniel Greene working with George Washington and in the combination of regular and irregular forces during the American Revolution. Part of our challenge and part of our threshold crossing challenge today is somewhat expanding back to the fuller utility and the fuller image of a special operator, a special operations leader operator, or a soft professional, because it's vital that we do so, because again, we're at a threshold crossing again into this new 4th age. And what I want to do is spend a few minutes just describing what that looks like. In fact, I would say we've been through and well beyond this crossing for many years now. Some scholars, I'll pick on Walter Russell Mead for a second, actually defines in a wonderful piece he wrote and published in 2013 called the End of History Ends. Really describes, and he pinpoints around sometime of the time period of 2013, really marking this next 4th age threshold crossing. We can talk a little bit more about that as we go forward in Q&A. But today America's Special Operations Forces face a moment of strategic inflection. Again, at this threshold crossing of at least 2 fundamental questions that I want to tease out tonight. First, how has the character of global geopolitical competition changed, and how is it changing? And to what implications for the future roles, missions, and force structures for special operations for the 2020s through and outwards towards the 2040s and even the 2050s? That's the work that we're doing here at the Joint Special Operations University, to kind of be vanguard to the vanguard force, to try to put a character and a fidelity or an understanding and a trustworthiness in anticipating what this new environment ahead of us, this extraordinary world, looks like as we make this crossing across the threshold crossing. This new 4th age is one of compound security threats and a changing character of global geopolitical competition that's governed by what we're calling a new and transformative compound security dilemma. I'm going to try to unpack some of that for you. This new threshold of global security affairs gives meaning to what we now popularly regard as the return of or return to great power competition. And it also raises fundamental questions of power and the use of force and the proper and effective roles of both in international affairs. So, and just bear with me, I'm trying to get the slides to progress. There we go. Great. So let me talk a little bit about this new security environment. The rise of what is being termed and understood as a return to great power competition, and at a moment of 4th technological revolution, to just make it even more complex and compounded, now disrupts the stability and fidelity or trustworthiness of the longstanding Western liberal international order. as well as questions and directly challenges American global leadership of that order itself. We must begin with an appreciation of the major disruptive change that has occurred in the global security environment, as this is one of the most complex and dangerous periods in our nation's history, I would argue globally. And I would say what makes it so uniquely dangerous is the nature of the threats themselves, which again have all compounded, largely due to the inability to address what the slide depicts. Overarching dynamics and underlying conditions or underlying currents, as one of my old bosses coined the term, or otherwise root causes of dilemmas, all of which fuel compound security threats, which are incredibly complex and multidimensional. They're trans everything, and they're also temporally dynamic and accelerative. These new boundary spanning compound threats are hard, if not impossible, to contain, and especially so by traditional means. They are transnational and transregional, again, trans everything, with the potential for metastasizing into big compound contagion wars with potential for global-wide disruptions. I would offer that one need not look any further than the conditions that led to the transregional Springs movements, tracking back at least to the 2006 period with the Orange revolutions in Ukraine, and of course, metastasizing into what we became popularly called the Arab Spring movements, as well as manifest in the likes of the rise of Al-Qaeda and the various variations of the so-called Islamic State. Such compound threat dynamics, however, do not begin or end with these Springs movements or the examples I've given with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. We have witnessed such cascading threat tendencies over the course of years, if not decades, and across, frankly, all public and private governmental and non-governmental sectors, which brings security and defense metastases defined of any and all prior traditional controls, dividing the so-called foreign from the so-called domestic, dividing the national and the international, et cetera, et cetera. I think nothing more than the example of the global coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic is a really great illustration, a tragic illustration of this compounding effect that we're talking about here. It defies all previous boundaries, particularly our institutional boundaries that we've set for ourselves. This environment also results in a growing tendency for nation states to more often drift towards self-help, unilateral solutions, reducible to their own individual security dilemmas. This, in part, is the result of a perceived weakening of international institutions and traditional alliances and their ability to address global problems in a timely manner. It's also a consequence, frankly, of revisionist states not playing by the established and broadly accepted rules and norms. Self-help behavior, therefore, exacerbates collective security problems, and as such, frustrates any efforts to address them in collective ways. This making coalitions for collective security and defense even more difficult, while also making the formation of such coalitions even more essential. This and others are the kinds of paradoxes that come part and parcel with this new compound security dilemma that now shapes and drives the dynamics of today's and tomorrow's international relations. Therefore, I would offer that compound threats demand nothing less than compounded solutions to achieve lasting and durable compound wins. And we offer here at JSAL that this is the solution for redefining Special Operations Forces' future utility. Gonna skip ahead a little bit. I want to transition now and talk with that backdrop and with that characterization of the international security environment. I want to get into the second part of this, which really talks about soft use and utility in this as part of this great power competition frame, and really in the context of some new language, relatively new language, that we speak of this spectrum of peace and warfare called the continuum of cooperation, competition, and conflict. That's probably very familiar to some of you. It's the latest joint doctrinal lexicon. Let me just begin with a couple of provocations here. First, history is illustrative, but only if we revisit it from time to time. and look and listen for its lessons. Let me just state up front, the first real big provocation perhaps. The so-called return to or return of great power competition isn't, right? At least not in the ways that we have traditionally thought of it. All past so-called returns to great power competition have found a renewed and amplified incidence of so-called small wars in irregular warfare. And this is the ground that you typically see the use of special operations forces. It's not the exclusive ground of special operations forces, but I would say it's the center of gravity of where you usually find the utility of special operations forces. The utility of SOF has always been a regulating rheostat. Think of a temperature gauge. Special operations forces always provided the nation and nations with that governing rheostat of competition and conflict, keeping and giving the nation an opportunity to keep both as indirect, limited, and low intensity as possible. This has helped preserve the relative peace below the threshold of full or total or even apocal great power-based conflicts and wars. It's been true through all cycles of so-called returns to or returns of great power competition. And just by the slide here, you can see we're talking about at least a century plus of special operations in great power, in so-called great power competition. Everything that we talk about in terms of limited wars and conflicts and utility of force and low intensity conflict. The spaces in between, as I like to call it. As the US and the West learned in the 20th century, preventing the Cold War from going hot was an essential element in the theory of victory in the strategic rivalry between communism on one side and democracy and capitalism on the other. The US and its allies and partners achieved their geostrategic interests in the Cold War without fighting the Soviet Union directly in open armed conflict, and the same logic can apply in the 21st century. Special operations forces have always provided the nation with this sort of below the threshold of armed conflict problem-solving capability. SOF professionals are problem solvers, exquisitely solving the country's problems, and importantly, in ways that avoid bringing a moral injury to the nation and to the force itself in the process. I would offer four imperatives in thinking about this, this continuum of SOF's utility as I've described it here as part of this continuum of cooperation, competition, and conflict. First of the four, SOF must be prepared for, always, and capable of and enabled to operate across this full continuum and comprehensively so. And what I mean by comprehensively so, I would say in full joint or in concert with joint sister services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space Force, et cetera, as well as interagency and intergovernmental, and equally importantly, in multinational force configurations, ways and means force packages. Secondly, and this is an important point and possibly a provocation in and of itself, national preferences for particular kinds of wars in service and soft enterprise, parochial emphasis and preferences for certain types and select types of warfare and utilities of force over others simply can no longer be permitted to persist and pervade in the determinations of policy, strategy, force modernization, and utility of force decisions. This has far too long fed the paradox within the American and the wider Western way of war and peace, producing Pyrrhic or limited results in the Western liberal order's approaches to securing a relative peace as we can come to know it. The power equation does no longer equates, particularly when force is applied in unilateral terms, in the broadest sense of those terms. Collective security and defense applications by, with, and through allies and partners, once upon a time perhaps a nice want to do and want to have, is now a must-have imperative, particularly if you want to win, and importantly, if you want to win in sustainable and legitimate ways for the long term. Thirdly, the global security environment of conduct is governed again by this compound security dilemma. All ways of cooperation, competition, and conflict, therefore, I would offer must be recalibrated accordingly. That covers things like preventive defense, active containment, competitive engagement, and deterrence, both general and specific. All of these must be relearned. They have to be recontextualized and re-understood in light of new compound security dilemma conditions. And fourthly, that compound security dilemma now makes unilateral, again, it makes unilateral approaches to all things a most rare if ever solution. Compound security now makes alliances and partnered approaches to the utility of force for power purposes less a choice and more a non-negotiable imperative. Nothing less than a comprehensive combined joint GIM-based approach to readiness will solve. And by GIM-based, I mean, again, joint, interagency, intergovernmental, and multinational. Let me get into a little bit of what this means for the future value of special operations forces. And let me just kind of first start with a metaphor that I think you'll pick up on quite quickly. You wouldn't use a contractor's power tools to perform laparoscopic surgery. And you also wouldn't use surgical tools to build a house. So therefore, in that metaphoric sense, the challenge for special operations going forward in this compound security environment is to identify where on the spectrum from quote unquote building the house, which might translate to preventing conflict, to performing surgery, which might translate to decisions on the appropriate use of force, comes the requirement to switch to a different set of tools. SOF has multiple tool sets, always has and always will, to operate along the entire spectrum of peace and warfare. Using them properly helps solve the dilemma. In short, choosing the right tools at the right time for the right problem to be solved is the gray matter requirement for SOF leaders now and into the future. Though our national security enterprise priorities have changed, the utility of SOF has not. In fact, if applied correctly, SOF can be more consequential, more important, and more decisive in a great power competition context than they have ever been during the last 20 years. Also, another factor of this fourth age, geography once again is returned with a vengeance and as a governing dynamic of international relations. And positional advantage is once again a determinative factor of this new compound security world disorder. US adversaries are now pursuing positional advantage through their strategies and actions that enable privileged access for them, but not everyone globally. And again, this slide that I've been hanging in the background here, it's a little fuzzy, but this really gives you a snapshot of this spectrum of peace and warfare, this continuum of cooperation, competition, conflict, and war. And it highlights what I have highlighted there is, we hear about and we talk about, we read a lot about the Gerasimov strategy, China's equivalent to that, what we loop together as the disruptors playbook of the two competitive adversaries of China's CCP and Russia's Kremlin. You can see the overlap, but really you see China's disruptors playbook really leaning more towards the left, more towards the classic diplomacy and geopolitics, where Russia picks up somewhere in the middle. And really, when you look at their disruptors playbook, it's all about disruption, all about negative aims-based applications of force for power purposes, really on the going from the center to from active infiltration to coercive signaling to warfare below and at the threshold of classic war by proxy and by surrogate, right? I think many times, just like we did during the Cold War with the Soviet, there was maybe a subconscious, at times, slight envy of, oh, pity the poor democracy, right? If only we could be unshackled from the pesky things called law and value. If we could just get the gloves taken off, we could actually go toe to toe and beat that Soviet in every battle, in every war. I would offer that it's extremely important to not make that kind of comparison. It wasn't right back during the last cycle of GPC, and it's certainly a dangerous proposition to envy too much the agility and the flexibility of the disruptors playbook and the disruptors way of being, more generally speaking. While the United States cannot and should not attempt to mirror these subversive approaches that seek to undermine the rules-based international order that the slide depicts, We can and must instead orient our efforts on positive aims that reinforce our democratic values and the ideas that underpin our conceptions of political sovereignty and territorial integrity, the very cornerstones of the international system that we actually seek to strengthen in our strategic competition with China, Russia, and other malign actors. We, the United States and the broader West, do this by helping our allies and partners in their efforts to build national resilience and resistance against such predatory, subversive, gray zone threats, and by helping to shape a mutually beneficial security environment through our foreign assistance and security cooperation programs. As far back as the origins in World War II, special operations in support of national resistance and resilience operations has long been a core competency of special operations, cornerstone to SOF's use and utility as an early indications and warning, strong pointing in that rheostat capability for nation. I think this is a very important point, and hopefully we can actually, that elicit some questions for the Q&A and living room discussion. I would go further and say that when looking for what constitutes a successful utility of any type or instrument of force, but SOF in particular, in this great power competition context, what constitutes a win lies left of the boom, if you will, left of the bang and the boom. It is here where special operations forces must relook and recalibrate all of our operations, activities, and investments, and that's what we are doing at the moment. And this slide here actually gives you a little bit of an artistic rendering of what that looks like across the entire spectrum of peace and warfare. The relevant impact of special operations forces utility in this so-called great power competition demands therefore nothing less than anticipating, finding, and creating ways and opportunities that allow us to do two things simultaneously. Let me emphasize this. First, you see these curves. The first imperative is bending, use of force, use of special operations to bend that escalation curve, right? On behalf of enhancement of deterrence. Bending the escalation curve of competition and conflict downwards. In other words, lowering the amplitude, or as a rate in that rheostat sense, lowering the temperature of the competition, keeping it below a fight, right? Lowering the amplitude of contestations of force and power. And then secondly, at the same time, extending those spaces in between. In other words, those lost moments of what I'd call relative peace, in those moments between relative peace and the next great power or epochal war. Or more importantly, to deter and prevent the next great power war from happening at all. Or as Sun Tzu, the famed and fabled Sun Tzu or Sun Tzu would call it, winning without fighting, achieving our national and collective nation states' interests, preferably before and without the fight. Let me speak a little bit briefly, a little bit more about this imperative of geostrategy and positional advantage. Now, as we know, Russia and China in Iran are deliberate in the what and the where of their activities. And it is in the where that makes issues of geostrategy all the more relevant to special operations. For example, amplifying around the year 2014, Russian operational reach in the places like the Crimea, Cyprus, Greece, Egypt, Syria have been all about holding the Eastern Mediterranean sea lines of communication at risk, and their involvement in Libya, just another example, enabling that operational reach directly under NATO's southern flank. When it comes to China's CCP, their first overseas military base in Djibouti, for example, provides a clear expression of its global ranging ambitions. Further, regarding China, China's efforts in places like Latin America are all about gaining influence to place the Panama Canal in a series of overlapping influence levers aimed at salami slicing to a new normal of either control or positional denial of US access, basing, and overflight, all while carving away support from Taiwan in other realms of the globe via One Belt, One Road, financial inducements to fragile democracies in the Western Hemisphere. China, Russia, and now Iran are doubling down across the globe on their efforts, and particularly in the Western Hemisphere for the Maduro regime in Venezuela, which directly threatens US and allied interests. Venezuela particularly is a major nexus of great power competition in the Western Hemisphere itself, and less than 4 hours commercial flight from the continental United States. So this notion, these traditional notions of proximate near abroads, that's an old story. That compound security in the global reach and the metastasis and the accelerated metastasis of this compound security dilemma breaks down all those traditional divides and all those traditional boundaries. Again, all this is still about gaining positional advantage on a global reach. Now, Chinese strategists think and write using these geopolitical terms, dividing the world up into regions or zones. They deploy concepts like heartland and rimland in their works, with frequent direct referrals to the great geostrategic theorists such as Sir Halford Mackinder and Alfred Thayer Mahan. Folks, your special operations force leaders need to think and begin to think and act in geopolitical terms as well, and particularly as we seek to achieve intellectual overmatch against such adversaries. I would say another thing that a geopolitical positional advantage approach by the threat does for a competitor or an adversary is that it allows one to focus their resources at what the famed George Kennan called the strong points. I think I've got a nice little slide illustrating that. For this next age, we will need special operations forces to play point versus area defense at or proximate to these geographic, human security, and cognitive strong points. And in so doing, it is important to note that the point of action may be far removed from the actual point of effects. And in that sense, special operations forces can indirectly affect behavior and decision-making calculations through actions that may be in other physical and non-physical, to include virtual, cognitive, and ideational domains. This is the exact logic of placing combined joint interagency task forces within what we call combined joint special operations task forces, or CJSOTFs, at or proximate to these geostrategic nexuses. And that what the slide shows is a depiction of what we actually established in terms of these force projection platforms, these semi static joint headquartering in C2 command and control nodes to cover the trans-regional space, covering what we call the greater Middle East in United States Central Command's area of interest and area of responsibility, just as one example. It is through such command and control and force projection platforms, again, that are strategically placed, where sustainable counterterrorism plus and combined with great power competition platforms, where the use of the employment and utility of SOF can and must be combined and integrated, and where and how compound threats can be effective cost overmatched. Selena hasn't given me the hook yet, so I'm counting on me having a few more minutes. I'm almost going to close. And what I'd like to do is really just close with a case example of everything I've talked about tonight in terms of the compounded threat dynamics and this utility of force, really a back to the future utility of force. And so let me just give you a quick snapshot of what we should be most familiar with, because it's still ongoing. Case in point, Syria. And I'll end with this. One need look no further than to Special Operations Forces operational placement in and throughout northeastern Syria since 2014, and how that presence and those roles have evolved over time for proof of principle of SOF's utility beyond counterterrorism and beyond counter-violent extremist organizations, and as well as beyond the context of the old frame, the GWAT. What began as an effort to destroy the physical manifestations of the caliphate, the so-called Islamic State Caliphate, through direct action, raids, and strikes, many times in concert with state and non-state actors committed to defeating ISIS, quickly became a mission to deter further Russian as well as Turkish territorial provocations, assure new partners, including the Syrian Kurds, deny freedom of action to Iran and its surrogates and proxies, defend critical resources and infrastructure, deny any resurgence of the Islamic State as an existential threat to friendly regional governments, and to maintain US access and influence where the East and the West truly converge. The fact that the US government did this with such minimal investment while assuming acceptable risk must be understood and appreciated, even lauded, for what it was, which is nothing less than a new paradigm in which the utility of special operations forces goes well beyond its 2 past decades of direct action merely in the context of counterterrorism, where direct action and counterterrorism are integral use of force activities endemic to and not separate nor separable from great power competition. It's an and, not an or. In this enlarged context, from use to utility of force, special operations serves as the rheostat again for this new geopolitical environment that challenges conventional wisdom, but demands new ways of thinking and acting to an array of threats, state and non-state, and the underlying conditions that drive them. Let me pause there. That's enough in the air, and it's enough provocations and enough description to hopefully elicit a great Q&A and open living room conversation. I will say I'm looking forward to your questions, and please feel free to ask me specifically in terms of from an educational activity, what JSOW itself as SOFS University is doing in terms of helping to educate and prepare the future leadership for this compound security world and environment that we are now at the threshold crossing of. Thanks for your time. Thanks for giving me the extra reach to get all the narrative out. And let me pause there and I'll kill the slides so we can have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Ike. So for everybody here who's joining us, it's quite a nice crowd tonight. The best way to ask questions to our guests tonight is to type your questions into the Q&A section. I'll give you all a moment to do that and ask Colonel Wilson just a quick question directly related, in fact, to how you ended, which is you're now president of Joint Special Operations University. You're here presenting a talk at Arizona State University, where you also joined us as faculty member. So really briefly, could you give us a sense of how you understand the mission of Joint Special Operations University and just the idea of what universities do as regards special operations and the pace moving forward and what needs to be done?
That's fantastic. Real quick, Joint Special Operations University, we are Special Operations Forces University. And so we are a hybrid organization. First and foremost, we're an academic college and university. And when I say university, since our mission is global, really JSOW is a college hub here in Tampa, Florida, where my office is. But the university is really a multiverse. It extends through a series of schools that represent each of the Army Special Operations, Army SOF, Marine Corps SOF, Naval Special Warfare SOF, what you're most familiar with, the Navy SEALs, Air Force Special Operations Forces. I would assume soon over the horizon, Space Commands, Special Operations Componency, right? Something that we're at a threshold on, we have to think about, as well as our connections with civilian academia, think tank community, et cetera, including, and that's a global reach. So our educational, we have educational relationships with allies and partners from an educational activity standpoint. So same as Arizona State University as an educational activity is JSOW and as part of one of our hats. But we also serve a professional service command, Special Operations Command with a public service, armed services mission. And so all of our teaching and learning, research and analysis, and service outreach has to be about application. It's applied science. And so my professorate are a blended mix of professors of academic discipline, PhDs, thought leaders, but also mixed with, and some of them at the same time, hybrids in and of themselves, of what we call professors of practice, the equivalents of PhDs in the act and the art of the doing, seasoned, full career SOF professionals, multiple master's degree, as well as the equivalent of PhDs from the art of the practice. That's what we do. We do everything from formal academic, teach to know and teach to inform courseware and coursework, just like a normal academic university. And then we go forward and actually do mobile education teams with U.S. forces in the field, as well as our international allies and partners. So I'll pause there. Everything in terms of what a normal academic faculty would do, though, Daniel, from scholarship, but our scholarship is scholarship with what I call scholarship with impact, with intentional impact for the force going forward. I can pause there if you'd like.
Sure, great. So we're getting some questions from those in attendance. So I'm going to put two questions together because they're related. They're not the same exactly. The first from Ethan Gershenfeld, who asks, how does emerging technology, particularly AI and its development race, contribute to the fourth age of warfare? Is it a cause of disruptive change or just a catalyst? And before answering, I'm going to add Patrick Gutierrez's question because it's related, which is, where does cyber warfare fit into the spectrum of disruptors playbook? And how is that placement expected to move between now and 2050? And then how does that relate to soft tools and methods? So it's a lot of questions, but it's about something related, which is AI, cyber, and how to address that with the rubric that you present.
Yeah, just like the nation we serve, America, one of the unique, exceptional parts of the American way of peace and warfare I would offer is innovative leveraging of technology, right? So no different for the nation's special operations forces. Technological advancements, emerging technology with an intent to disrupt the other has always been at the forefront of all instruments of force and power, particularly in military circles, whether it's the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, or Space Force. Certainly true for special operations. One of the things that's unique to Special Operations Command is that we actually have our own unique acquisition technology and logistics production line and our own special budget for that in order to be leading edge of the state of the art, working with defense labs and the like in the RTD&E and the innovative development of new technological hardware and software solutions, and increasingly bridging those in with the human element for human machine combinations. But that's always been the case, right? Whether you go back to World War II and the days of Wild Bill Donovan and the OSS, they were doing unique at the edge technological experimentation with things like radar and new forms of telecommunication. So really, it's a back to the future in many respects. It's a continuation of the theme of technology, really allowing us to keeping us at the razor's edge. Today we're talking about different types of technologies. I think it was Ethan who spoke specifically to AI and machine learning, right? We are spending an enormous amount of time and attention on unpacking those categories of AI and machine learning. In many respects, they become a capture term for everything and almost leave us with a feeling of nothing. We're really going into the details and unpacking what AI does, particularly as human integrating with the human machine teaming. There are 6 specific areas that our AT&L element in SOCOM is focusing on. I'll just list these out for you all. Network and data management is an area of specific focus. Next generation effects and precision strike, looking for how AI and machine learning can enable that. Next generation intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and tactically relevant what we call sensitive activities. The classified realm of soft operations, I'll just leave it at that since we're on class here. What we're calling the hyper-enabled operator, right? Covering everything from really the equivalent of a cybernetic infusion of technology to the human operator, to the point of experimentations with things like how to make the soft operator invisible, right? In every sense and context of that term that you can figure out. We're working with technology labs actually delving into those types of questions and seeking solutions. Next generation mobility. And then last but not least, biotech and human interface. Those 6 areas fall into a collective body of technological work that we're calling the hyper-enabled operator suite of technological functions. What the university is doing our best to keep pace with the technological takeoff, right? So that we can ensure that as we hyper enable the operator with fourth technological revolution, technological enablers, that we are doing the cognitive work on the human element, the operator themselves, so that as we hyper enable, we're also highly educating, so that at the end of the day, and I think this is Patrick's question, we can assure that technological advancements have the disruptive effects intended of technology to disrupt the other and not ourselves, not to overload and cognitively paralyze the soft operator themselves, right? So that we can have a revolution in political military affairs driving the train and not a revolution in technological affairs driving it instead. I think the second part of the question was cyber. Cyber fits into all of this. Some of our heaviest investments from the command standpoint is in internet-based MISO, military information security operations, MISO operations. So emphasis on informational advantage and strategic influence operations. If you think about this fourth age, I would offer that the next generation, the fourth age's tip of the spear when it comes to special operations forces is going to be more in the realm of the soft operator getting back to some of its earlier pre-World War II and World War II activities. Daniel and I were talking before the session, really back to the longer heritage of the special operator, which really characterized the special operator certainly as a direct action operator, but equally, if not more so, what I'd call the military political anthropologist, if you will, right? Well prepared and capable and knowledgeable of the human dimensions and the cognitive dimensions of human activity, that whole security, human security realm. But we can tell by the disruptors playbooks, right? I mean, cyber, both offensive and defensive cyber, new tip of the spear of our adversaries and our competitors. And likewise, therefore, the work that we're putting in really focus on those realms as well to match and overmatch the adversary. And I'll leave it at that.
So it's a great transition to several questions from the attendees. I'm going to present a couple of them to you because they have overlap and they play into what you were just talking about. So from Joseph Shepard, in the relationship of soft beyond direct response and action, or as a foreign troop multiplier, what are new avenues for soft responsibilities or duties? Related, from Thomas Allen, I recall that Green Berets in the past used soft power, for example, working with local villagers to build clean water systems, build sanitary systems. Is this still a special ops job description? And then added to this is just, in your current role, what do you see as special operations, special qualities, particular qualities right now? And how will all of this, how might this look 10 years from now? So that's sort of a lot of questions put together, but I want to make sure that as many attendees as possible can have their questions heard. And I think there's some relationship between those questions.
That's super. Wow. Let me unpack that. Great questions. I think Joseph's question, new areas. Again, I would put right up front, internet-based MISO, right? The old label, psychological operations, but really leveraging the information environment, leveraging informational advantage and for the purpose of strategic and operational influence campaigning, right? We understand this by when we look at the kind of negative aims-based activities that Russia's Kremlin and China's CCP have been enacting, particularly Russia is a clear example with incursions into the US and Western powers' electoral systems, right? The Kremlin's use of going back old school with 21st century technological enablement to the old school tradecraft of targeted poisonings, right? All these factors, really a wicked combination of really old school tradecraft, analog tradecraft, combined with 21st century technological enablements, a really wicked witch's brew. These are the new areas that we are delving into. So when you look at the 12 classic mission sets of SOF, and I think this goes into one of the second sequel questions tied into this bundle, you're going to see the fourth age SOF adaptive all domain leader operator, getting back to a 21st century version of unconventional warfare, foreign internal defense. You know, again, the more of the working by, with, and through that military, political, social anthropologist, that kind of work. You're going to see us working and operating more in concert with interagency partners. The 3D model, the old label of 3D, defense, development, and diplomacy. I would put those in a different order, intentionally so. Development, diplomacy, and then, and only then as a last resort, the imperatives of applications of force from a quote unquote defense realm, but more collective, integrative activities and operations. Really, you know, going back to the 1960s film of the Green Beret, you know, that John Wayne Green Beret portrait of the single or small team ODA that's actually operating in villages, working with partners and allies, quietly, deliberately, and really at that root cause level that I talked about early on in the presentation. I had that slide talking about overarching dynamics and underlying currents and root cause, really operating in the human security realm. So internet-based WESO, civil affairs, you're gonna see that as, I would offer the new fourth age tip of the spear. Does that mean that we're not going to be doing direct action? We're not going to be doing the raids and hostage crisis rescue and all the things that the public has been most familiar with, the Bin Laden raids, the Abu Bakr raids over the last 20 years. That's essential. That's going to be cornerstone. Necessary but insufficient. Necessary but insufficient. You're going to see the fourth age SOF leader operator, really a pentathlete, if you want to think of it in those terms, covering the 10 to 12 classic mission sets in new combinations and configurations, and operating in support of things like national resistance and resilience operations, increasingly in partnership with, I would offer, it will be unusual when you see unilateral applications of special operations forces or any force. It's going to be in partnership. In a follow and support role, you'll see special operations in a follow and support role, following our diplomats, following our USAID development partners, following our foreign allies and partners, right? So I think that covers most of it. Oh, special qualities 10 years from now. Gosh, 10 years from now, I think we're looking at, the new label we're using, right? We oftentimes talk in terms of SOF operators, vice SOF enablers, right? We're getting out of that language, and I think that's portends where we're seeing the force going forward 10 years plus from now. We're really talking more in the context of the SOF professional, much more inclusive, talking about inclusivity and diversification. You're going to say, let me put it this way. I mean, we're going to be doing, you're going to see a lot more diversity and inclusion across the force. What it means to be a SOF operator as part of the SOF professional rubric. It's going to cover folks that include the prototypical Navy SEAL, but also the young kid in jeans and flip-flops who's an expert hacker. It's going to include some of what we're developing now, very new and innovatively with our new Space Force. It's going to be the Guardian, what we call the Guardians. I'm very interested to see what develops in terms of an identification of a special operations utility that's going to be born out of the regular force that is Space Force. I mean, that's where SOF is born. Let me just paint a picture here. I would say that with all that said, the fights of tomorrow we can't forget, it's still going to be a Green Beret. It's still going to be a Navy SEAL, a Marine Raider, an Air Commando, all of which at the point with a buttstock in her shoulder. I'm emphasizing her shoulder next to a partner, right? In contrast, our adversaries at most will have transactional surrogates. I think that's very important. If we do our work right in developing and fostering the next generation soft professional, it's going to be a complement of hims and hers and they, doing all the classic things, a Back to the Future complement of doing all the things from the previous 3 ages in new ways with new techniques, heavy emphasis on informational advantage and strategic influence, hyper enabled through 21st century technological advancements, and most importantly, tightly bound by, with, and through allies and partners. The United States and the West will win if we are talking about in 10, 20 years from now, collective security and defense by, with, and through allies and partners, because at best, our so-called great power competitors and adversaries will have at best transactional surrogates. And that's not a winning combination, because again, those compound security dynamics demand nothing less than partnership, true, genuine, sustained partnership. So that would be the picture I would paint for you going in the future. But there's going to be a lot more ecumenical opportunity from an accessions and selections set of opportunities to become what we would call a special operator, a soft professional. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Ike, and everybody who's on out here attending the event. We've hit 6:30, but because there's so many questions here and they're so interesting, I thought we would extend the event a little bit longer. And
Great.
I will ask a compound question from 2 of our colleagues as the final question, but it's a double question, or maybe even more than that. And then we'll just do a send off after that. If you all have to leave because of the time, that's of course fine. We appreciate everybody who's joining us tonight. So first from David Soroki, a colleague in the School of Politics and Global Studies. He would like to know if you could provide 1 or 2 examples of the sort of conscious impact inspired research that's being done at Joint Special Operations University. And then that's a very specific question. And again, I'd like to link that to another specific question on a different but related theme from another colleague, Pam Delargy, also in the School of Politics and Global Studies. Her question is kind of complicated in an actual base because it deals with the current conflict in northern Ethiopia involving Eritrea and Somalia, the United Arab Emirates, and its destabilizing impact on the Horn of Africa as it pulls in other countries, Sudan, Egypt, South Sudan. Pam has done a lot of work in the region, is really an expert on all of this. But her question is, and this is related to David's question and to your presentation more generally, which is, even though technology is a key part of the conflict through drones and other advanced technologies, how is it that with all of the advanced technology the US possesses, it appears that the US still has only limited understanding of what's happening on the ground and what damage is being incurred, and what could be done from a special operations perspective to address this? So it's a specific request about a specific place, and then David's question is about specific particular kinds of impact research being done at Joint Special Operations University.
Awesome. And let me just, David, and was it Pamela?
Yeah, Pamela, yes.
Pamela. Okay, great. Thanks, David. Thanks, Pamela, for the great combined questions. Let me start with David's 1 or 2 examples of research. One of the beautiful things about being the president of Joint Special Operations University is our proximity to the command and the commanders and the operators themselves. So what I've been doing for the last, great opportunity in the last 3-4 weeks is having virtual touches with all the commanders worldwide, all the special operations commanders, our service component commanders, and what we call our theater soft operational commands worldwide. So I was just talking a couple of days ago with our 2-star admiral who commands special operations component central command, covers the greater Middle East, right? Week before I was talking to what we call SOC-EUR for European region. And next week I'm talking to Pacific Command. And so the ability to, unlike a normal college, university, or even the other service professional military education systems, the ability to be able to virtually connect with and to go visit physically those clients, if you will, and have that dialogue and get the demand signal for what kind of research and analysis, what type of courseware, what type of new knowledge that needs to be generated for the force, current and future. Nothing compares in comparison. Two examples. We just launched this past week at the request of our SOC Central Command Greater Middle East command team, a collective study group, a combination of a doctor, a professor of academic discipline, political anthropologist by background, married up with one of our elite professors of practice, highly experienced SOF operator and scholar in his own right. They formed a team and they're doing a project, a longitudinal project, multi-month, multi-year in fact, project focused on countering irregular adversaries, bringing social science research, political science, anthropological research to the puzzles of the Middle East over the last 2 decades and what persists in new forms and fashions going forward. That's one example. We just launched that this week. So applied science to real world puzzles, current and the future, to help a command get closer to those root causes and to that anthropological acculturation understanding of the human security as well as the geographic terrain that defines this new world disorder that I talked about tonight. Another example, similarly, we're commissioning a collective group of individual researchers doing basic research and a couple of collective research teams to help our special operations forces in European Command to get a better fidelity at human security level in in and across the Western Balkans. Particularly focused on in the areas of support to national resistance and resilience operations. And so really a combination of from the classroom to really an applied learning model that we see from our research teams and being able to bring that information back from the field and put back into traditional classrooms. That's a very unique quality to professional military education, college or university, and particularly to the Joint Special Operations University. In terms of Pamela's question, how do we continue to get it wrong when we have all these technological enablers? Lots of ideas there, Pamela, and I'd love to just continue the conversation even by email after this as we go forward. But what I will state briefly for the moment, what immediately comes to mind in terms towards an answer, perhaps, is where the episodic presence, again, being present or even deploying forces in the immediate, at the threshold of a conflict, which I would offer by the time you're taking, paying attention to some of these dynamics, the root causes have already metastasized, if you will, into a crisis. Right? But what if we could actually be present at the invitation of a partner and an ally in a non-invasive, even non-military in a traditional sense of the terms, preventive defense type posture and preparedness and profile, working by, with, and through those allies and partners on behalf of a combined interest in relative security and stability. Again, more of that 3D model of a combination and the utility of defense and security force to include special operations forces in followership to the work of our development experts, and I'll pinpoint USAID, and in a followership to our foreign service officers in from our State Department. I think something on the sorts of a 21st century OSS model where you see special operations forces more intimately and not just in a liaison kind of way, but more in what we call a seconded relationship, long enduring, growing up together relationships with our intelligence community, right? The kind of models that we saw back during the period of World War II and the decade and a half, 2 decades following, where the intelligence community and special operations forces and our development community and our diplomats walked and grew up hand in hand and did truly deep integrative presence operations across the whole spectrum of peace and warfare, not just getting involved in deploying forces forward at the threshold of a trigger moment of a conflict, but really being there preventatively for a collective combination of self-interest, but a collective purpose at the early stages, the benign, relatively speaking, stages of cooperation, so that we are able to manage the relationships and manage and keep that rheostat temperature gauge down to where we never actually reach the metastasis of a crisis in the first place. I mean, let me just conclude with another quick example. Violent extremism can be prevented if we avoid the root causes that trigger and metastasize extremist behavior in the first place. So before that, perhaps get involved with pre and de-radicalization. That means getting an understanding of some of the root causes that cause perpetual have-nots in a have-nots arrangement in terms of a social contract between the governed and the governors, to not become a chronic situation to where the have-nots are so perpetually have-nots that they become want-nots in a violent sense. So really escalation ladder management, but in the reverse. Try to reverse this to where you don't give root to things like the takeoff of insurgency, which once you're dealing with an insurgency, what you're dealing with is a failure and a loss of legitimacy and a trust bond between the once incumbent government and those that government intends to govern, right? You have to get on the left side of those booms, if you will, like I talked about earlier in the talk. We have to be engaged with our partners and allies, and not purely in an altruistic manner, right? Which I'm all for altruism, but I'm also a pragmatist. Our own national self-interest would demand that we do more by, with, and through collective security and defense operations with partners and allies, because of the compound security issue. We can't solve our own individual problems without caring about those problems of our partners and allies. If we realize that, and once we realize that and actually truly act, even from a self-interest base, but through collective action, I think that puts us on a better, more promising path towards what a few years back we were calling sustainable security. And so I would leave it at that. But Pamela, I think part of the reason why we, despite all the technological things and the force that we can throw at a problem, again, the power equation does not equate, because perhaps we've gone too long with equating and conflating our understandings of power with our utility of force. If you just look at Newton's power equation, power and force are not the same. They're mutually effective. You can't have one without the other, but power equals force times how you use the force, or times displacement over time, right? And just our body of work over time has been impoverished by our conflation of what constitutes power and what constitutes force. We talk the language of soft and hard and smart power, but really, are we talking about true power, or are we really talking about force? I mean, that's a whole nother conversation. It's going to be part of the thing, one of the things that we cover in understanding great power competition, the course that I have an opportunity to teach with ASU starting mid next month. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Ike, it's great to have you with all of us today, and thank you everybody who's joined us. I think it's a nice place to end this conversation, because Ike has been a phenomenal partner for many years, in fact. And the Joint Special Operations University is one of the co-sponsors of our annual Future Security Forum, which is our sort of a marquee event that brings together major thought leaders on security. And the previous institution that he directed, the Security Studies Institute at the Army War College, is also a co-sponsor. So I'm just, but more than just this co-sponsorship and these institutional links is and this is behind the last two questions, is in what way can critical thinking be used to bridge profound institutional and disciplinary barriers and silos that we all know exist, whether it's between public research universities and those who are doing critical policy making in the military or in other bodies of government. So this is a real challenge. And I think that's really what was underlying those questions. And it's a great place to sort of end this evening. Thank you all for joining us. I only want to also thank Selena Daniel, who did all the logistics and putting all this together. And also just to let you know, our next event is February 11th, the next event in the Spring Speaker Series. It's called Inside the Walled Garden, Understanding the Chinese Internet by one of our ASU Future Security Fellows at New America, Yiling Liu, who's a journalist based in China and who writes for the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, and other publications. And then on February 17th, so it'll be the event after the February 11th event, will be Ted Johnson, a longstanding colleague of ours, speaking about the challenge of Black patriotism, building on a New York Times Magazine piece he wrote by the same title. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate your time, and we're thrilled that you could all be part of our community tonight. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.